I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Welcome to On Watch, everybody, the Judicial Watch podcast, where we take a deep dive behind the headlines to cover news that the mainstream media would rather you not know about. We try to recover some lost history, and we also try to explain the inexplicable. And we have quite a task before us today. I'm very pleased that joining me here on Watch is Dr. Shea Bradley-Farrell, president of Counterpoint Institute, and also senior international fellow at the Center for Fundamental Rights in Budapest, Hungary. And that is where we are recording this show today. We're coming to you from Budapest, Hungary, in the Center for Fundamental Rights. We also thank our good friends at the Center for Fundamental Rights, the Director General, Miklos Zanto, for being kind enough to allow us to use his recording studio today. So thank you to our friends at CFR. Welcome, Dr. Shea.
Glad to be here, Chris. It was an unusual happening. I guess we were scheduled to come to this conference to speak in Budapest on a international pro-Israel conference. And the day we were packing to go, Saturday, we found out what had happened in Israel. So it became much more timely.
So like I said, like Dr. Shea just said, this pro-Israel conference, had been on the books for a couple of months. We have both been invited to come over and speak. You were going to speak on what topics? What were you teed up to talk about?
Well, and I did talk about the Abraham Accords and the success of them, how they are really genius, that not only bringing more peace and stability to the area of the Middle East, but there are countries like the UAE, Bahrain, that through the accords have acknowledged the sovereignty of Israel and that Israel is a state.
And how much credit does President Trump get for that?
Very little. Nobody knows that
he gets zero credit for doing that.
Probably very few people listening right now know that he's responsible for those agreements.
First of all, they don't know what the Abraham Accords are.
Right.
They have zero knowledge of it. Secondly, even though you can list off all the successes and describe them, no one ever attributes it back to President Trump. That was your topic.
Yes.
And what were some of the points you wanted to make concerning the Abraham Accords, particularly in light of the attacks that happened Saturday?
Well, as you know, my background is economic development, and the Abraham Accords did not just bring more peace and security to the region. So there were 4 signatories on the Abraham Accords with Israel: UAE, Bahrain, and then later Morocco and Sudan. But as I was getting ready to say, they didn't just bring security to the region, but they have economically prospered the countries that signed with Israel. So to give you an example, the trade between the four countries in Israel had been very low, relatively low. But from 2020, when the accords were signed, to 2022, the trade increased to, it was right under $3 billion. One example that I like to cite, because you can see the difference, is the UAE and Israel were conducting trade with each other around about $180 million. And then a year later, in 2021, it had increased to $1 billion.
So pre-Abraham Accords,
yes,
$180 million. They sign off the Abraham Accords, which basically says diplomatic recognition back and forth.
Yes.
And an openness to business. And 180 million goes to 1 billion.
That's right.
And that's just with the UAE.
That's exactly right, just with the UAE. So in my way of thinking, the Abraham Accords are genius. It's a genius type of peace treaty, really.
Right.
Because it's not just throwing money at a country, appeasing them, saying, hey, be my friend, or let's just do this peace treaty that there's maybe nothing in it for the Arab states, so to speak, or at least they can't see it. But this is a very mutually beneficial way to security and peace in the Middle East. That it's really unprecedented. And if you if you know about the Abraham Accords, then you can watch the success of the economic development in the Middle East as a result of it, but also the normalizing of relations between Arab states and Israel. So I think it was a genius concept.
And so that normalization and success probably freaked out Hamas and other Islamist supremacist groups in the Middle East because they don't want to see success. They don't want to see Israel engaging in good diplomatic relations, business relations with other Arab or Islamic countries. And that makes them very nervous and anxious. And there was a new initiative, or an initiative that was being carried forward with Saudi Arabia. Yeah,
so it looks like Saudi Arabia is very close to signing an agreement with Israel under the Abraham Accords. And this not only made Hamas feel very threatened, but I believe it made Iran feel very threatened. And that was an idea a few of us were talking about. And then we had the mayor of of Jerusalem, who was supposed to be at the conference, but was not able to come. She did a teleconference and she said the same thing, that she felt that Iran was very threatened by, Iran does not like the relations between Sunni Arabs, which is what is mainly in Saudi Arabia, with Israel. This is a bad thing to Iran and
who are Shia. And so there's already that tension to begin with.
That's right. That's right. Centuries and centuries of tension. And she said also that she agreed with that. I would like to say this, though, because I think it's important. One of the things that was brought up during the conference when this question was asked, did the Abraham Accords sort of push the attacks to happen? One of the things that our Israeli friends that were able to come that brought up, not everybody was able to come that was slated, was that, Hamas doesn't need an excuse to attack Israel. It's actually in their charter that they are to kill Jews. So in their foundational, like you said, charter, their foundational documents, their statement of beliefs, their mission, their principles, they explicitly call for the extermination of Jews. And secondly, no peace. No truce, no armistice. Theirs is a final, to steal the expression from the Nazis, they have a final solution. And that final solution that they adopt is the extermination of Jews. That's exactly right. It's their final solution. And if you look at it in that context, then they don't need an excuse to attack Israel. However, it is my belief that at least the intensity of the attack may have been ramped up because of the success of the Abraham Accords, or the timing may have been moved up. I do think that it was a factor in it. For example, if you look when President Trump put out the Peace to Prosperity plan, which was a Palestinian-Israeli peace plan, his plan, which also was a genius plan in my view, not even a week right after that, Palestinians increased attacks on Israelis during that time. So I think anytime there's any sort of normalizing of relations for Israel, Iran and Hamas gets very worried about it.
So there's a lot of evidence that the Iranians had a hand in this attack, and that Hamas was trained, equipped, given intelligence, targeting, tactics, techniques, all the sort of components for the attack. From what you heard at the conference, do you have any sort of impressions or ideas about how that was discussed, or what the relevance of that is, particularly in light of, Iran's involvement, kind of fomenting Hamas, again, with the issue of the Abraham Accords kind of hanging out there as something that was scaring them or provoking them in some way.
Yeah, and actually, I kind of want to turn the table on you, because you spoke at the conference too, and you talked about the military aspect of it. And I would rather you put that in your own words and explain to your audience. But there's one thing that I do want to say before we go on. about the time that I spent on the border of Gaza.
Yeah, this is so for our viewing and listening audience, this is important. There's all kinds of people who are talking heads who have bright ideas about stuff, and that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But you've actually been there, and you've stood on the ground and seen what's happened, and I won't steal your thunder in the story, but you have firsthand experience about this. So tell our viewers and listeners what your experience on the ground in Israel was.
Yeah, I was with a group from AIPAC, National Christian Leaders, and we had gone all over, literally from north to south, east to west in Israel. And on our approach to the Gaza border, missiles were being fired from Gaza into Israel. And we had to wait for a little while. In fact, I put a video up of this from 2019 on my social media if anybody wants to see it. But we were told we had to hang back, and we had to hang back near a bomb shelter in case we needed to run into it. We were fine. Everybody was fine in our group. But when we were able to finally approach the border, we talked to residents there. And what I didn't understand is that they live like that. They live with bomb shelters in their communities that they run into, whenever. So this was something that was really driven
so
home.
rocketing is not unusual.
It's not unusual.
It got a lot of attention in the last few days.
Right.
But Israelis have been living with rockets coming out of Gaza.
That's right.
For years.
They act like it's a normal thing.
Right.
And maybe we can talk about this more later, but it's not just that side that they have security pressure from.
Right.
We also went to Lebanon and saw the areas where Hezbollah digs tunnels under from Lebanon into Israel to infiltrate, come up there, do terrorist attacks. We went to the Syrian border where we saw the UN peacekeeping station there. Syria is a threat to Israel. So they have threats on almost every border that they have, and they live like that. That's why they're very military minded, why they have, so many young people coming from all over the world who are Jewish, but have been born outside of Israel, come to serve their time in the IDF.
Right.
So, but anyway, you should tell everybody about the psychological aspects and the military invasion.
Dr. Shea was going to talk about the Abraham Accords and the relevance and importance of that. And our friends here at the Center for Fundamental Rights have invited me to go and speak about Biden Middle East policy, whatever that is. And
we should talk about that too.
And so there was an opportunity to discuss it. And of course, one of the things that's most disturbing is that Biden had just released, literally weeks ago, $6 billion in frozen assets.
That's right.
Back to the Iranians. If the Iranians are, financing, sponsoring, training, supporting tactics, logistics, intelligence for this Hamas attack, arguably the United States, or at least the Biden administration, is sponsoring terror. Now, the Biden administration would do backflips to explain how they can guarantee that $6 billion wasn't used for terror.
It's not true.
But the money's all fungible.
It
right?
is,
So,
yes.
And it's one of these deals where if you have a credit here, you can hold it against
Yes.
whatever you want to use it for. So that kind of misses the point. It's a hyper legalistic, hyper semantic dissection of explaining the money, which is at its heart dishonest. At least in my opinion, it's dishonest. So rather than really talk a lot about Biden Middle East policy, what I wanted to do, based upon what happened Saturday, was add sort of the military and intelligence perspective, because everybody else is talking about policy and strategy, which is great. Policy and strategy is important, but there was nobody there talking about sort of the military and intelligence and psychological operations aspect of what had occurred.
And that's your background.
So I have a particular set of experiences in that. So first of all, and I hate this expression because it's overused to the nth degree, but for lack of a better term, there was an intelligence failure on the part of the Israelis. And so just so folks understand, the Israelis commit an incredible amount of resources to collecting intelligence against Gaza and other places too. The West Bank, obviously, up against Hezbollah in Lebanon, but when we're talking about Gaza right now. And so Gaza is under a microscope. The Israelis have drones up, aircraft, They collect every flavor of intelligence you can imagine.
Mhm.
So signals intelligence, communications intelligence,
Huge.
measurements and signatures intelligence, all looking at both capability and intention.
And human intelligence too, right?
That's in my view, the most important one, because human intelligence gives you intentions
Mhm.
and not just capability. So all the platforms that they have up, air, land, and sea, and the persons that they recruit to be human sources to tell them stuff, for whatever reason, and this is really astounding,
Mhm.
the Israelis were flat on their feet. They were caught with their pants down. And what it also shows is that Hamas is capable of conducting very low-tech operations,
That's right.
and that they were able to have enormous discipline and control and security in their operations.
Which perhaps leads to Iran again, right?
Right. So, and the reason I bring up this, so if you're not using cell phones and you're not using GPS and you're not turning on emitters, and that could be a radar, that could be all kinds of things, showing movement, showing communication. When you shut down the signals intelligence profile, you can sometimes blind a very high-tech adversary who's trying to watch you, because there's no there. There's no signal to intercept. And I think that's what Hamas is capable of doing. They also had their leadership traveling up to Beirut. Their travel was masked, because the Israelis would have detected travel of key leaders to Beirut.
That's amazing, isn't it?
The meetings in Beirut were masked in some way, because they were meeting with Iranian Al-Quds, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps leadership, to get that training and money and tactics. And so all of this is a big void. It's a zero. And then this attack is launched.
Right. I want you to talk about that, please, because it really made an impression on me, the psychological aspect of it. Yeah. And I want to make sure I put out here first, I'm just assuming everybody knows this, but I, and Counterpoint Institute, my organization, stands solidly with Israel's right to defend itself.
Absolutely.
And these attacks were extremely brutal. There were no rules in these attacks, with babies, old ladies, women, rape. There were no rules to war in this, and they were very heinous crimes. And one of the things that I have been researching and studying, because I'm writing a book for the Center for Fundamental Rights that will be out in a couple of months, talking about Hungarian national sovereignty, one thing I learned during the communist era here is that the Soviets they had great control by using psychological tactics. And you talked about that at the conference with Israel. So
so you have to understand that rocket attacks and the type of rockets that the Hamas terrorists use are unguided missiles. They're literally, it's a metal tube packed with explosives and an accelerant that launches them. And what they're fire and forget. They take off, they go wherever. The fuel runs out and they drop. And so there's no targeting, there's no precision. They are a terror weapon. This is like what the Nazis did to World War II London with the Blitz and their V1 and V2 bombs that were just sent that away. No particular guidance, no targeting to them. And so it's estimated that at the time of the attack on Saturday, Hamas launched between 5,000 and 6,000 of these rockets. Today, right now, they're still firing rockets into Israel.
And
hundreds.
So your point is that they're hitting homes, they're hitting civilian populations.
Don't care what it hits.
Doesn't matter.
Right. They're not going after some military headquarters or some communications tower. They're just blanketing the Israeli population, that's countryside. So that's number one. That's a terror weapon. And you're sitting there, you were sitting there in 2019 and people run for bunkers because they're not targeted. It's scattered spray. So you were terrorized. You didn't even know it. You were being terrorized. then the second component has to do with this ground invasion. So they pulled down fencing using bulldozers. They ran into Israel. There's thousands of Hamas terrorists who did this. They rode in on motorbikes and in cars. They infiltrated the country. They would go to places like kibbutz and start killing civilians.
Mm-hmm.
And they both killed women and children, the elderly, and took some hostage. And there's guesstimates that there's at least 150 hostages that were dragged back into Gaza. And they were dragged back into Gaza. It was done so brutally. So people were horribly injured and harmed. And then they were made fun of. They were terrorized. They were beaten. They were raped. They were brutalized. Again, this is all psychological operations. This is an effort to intimidate and terrorize. The taking of hostages is a psychological operation meant to intimidate and brutalize and really create terrorist fear in the Israeli population.
And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the end goal of that is really to destroy a person's will to fight back. Is it not? To scare the population so badly that they give up, that they live in discouragement. And this is the kind of things that I read about the communist psychological warfare. And so you had brought up at the conference, that was a very similar thing. It's an actual tactic of war.
It is. It is very unconventional. It's actually outside the law of warfare, because there truly is a law governing warfare. These are all terror tactics that are meant to paralyze the opponent, in this case, Israel. And so it's also meant to provoke Israel into overreacting.
That's right.
Right. And so Israel's been very clear. They seek to eliminate Hamas. They don't seek to eliminate the Palestinian people. What they're looking at is the military terror organization, the military leadership of that terror component, and to eliminate them. And they have to, because it's an existential threat. They're trying to destroy the country, and it's unprovoked. So this was one of these situations where Israel has an absolute right to defend itself. They've been attacked brutally in a terroristic way.
Many times.
And they're going to respond. And in this case, they've had enough, because this was their 9/11. Proportionally, it was the same impact on the country as 9/11 was to us in America.
More so.
And so now here's the other part of the lesson here, is that Israel is going to launch a ground campaign into Gaza. Just in the last day, they've announced that everyone should evacuate the northern third, essentially, of the Gaza Strip, because that area is now a military target for the Israeli army. They're going to engage in urban combat, which has a host of very grave consequences.
Very costly.
On both sides.
Yeah.
It is going to be extraordinarily violent and destructive on the Gaza side of the equation. And on the Israeli side of the question, it takes a tremendous toll financially on the IDF itself, the Israeli army, because this is a combat environment in urban warfare where they're not just fighting block to block or fighting house to house. They're literally fighting doorway to doorway. And there's sufficient images on the internet, on the news, showing what Gaza looks like now. My feeling is it's going to be turned into essentially lunar landscape when they get done.
And you had also said that part of that psychological aspect of the war was they were anticipating a very large attack from Israel.
Correct.
And in a sense, they don't care.
Yeah.
They want Israel to strike them so hard that the international community turns against them, which is a concern of mine.
This is the other part of how this game is played out. I don't mean game in a trivializing way. I mean game in the sense of it's move, counter move kind of strategy. So Israelis are going to be fighting doorway to doorway. As they move building to building, doorway to doorway, they will have active opposition coming at them from Hamas that stays embedded there and fights to the last.
And the thing about being in such a densely populated area is you don't know where it is or where it's coming from.
That is, so you're going to have car bombs.
Yeah.
You're going to have snipers. And as the Israelis move doorway to doorway, building to building, and they go to clear a building, they go into the building, guaranteed Hamas has already booby-trapped half the building. So you're going in to clear the building, knowing that you may have active opposition from shooters, but you also have a building that's probably been wired to explode. And so you're in clearing the building and the building collapses on you.
Yeah.
This takes an impact. This takes a huge toll on the IDF forces actually conducting these operations.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're constantly looking over your shoulder and you're not really sure what you're going into next.
You don't know where it's coming from.
Incredibly high stress, incredibly high sort of operation or tempo for the IDF to do what they're going to do. Now, the second part of that is what you just mentioned, and that is it's already started. I was going to give it a week or two. It's turned out to be like 2 days, 3 days.
Yeah, it was very fast that people have started turning against Israel.
The press and the UN and a bunch of organizations are now flipping it around and saying, well, Israel has to exercise restraint.
Mm-hmm.
They can't order an evacuation of Gaza. They can't turn off the water and electricity. They have to watch out for civilian casualties. They have to. So all these new conditions, not new conditions, but conditions that will now be imposed on them
Mm-hmm.
In a way that is not commensurate with what they've suffered as an attack, and also what their ability is to come back and combat Hamas.
Yep, and they're a sovereign nation. They have every right to defend themselves. It's like if, Mexico started sending missiles over into Texas and Arizona and New Mexico, and we should sit on our hands, right, and do nothing about that. I mean, the border, you can look at that as an invasion for sure. I believe we are being invaded, but let's set that aside for a second. We have a right to defend ourselves as a sovereign nation, and I do realize, like, I think 4 consecutive prime ministers in Israel, their strategy has been, like you said, just target the militants, the certain leadership aspects over back into the Gaza Strip with missiles. But this is, to me, the gloves are off. And in my opinion, I've always thought that they should push back more. But I'm hoping that also, can we talk about the international community and the support and the reality of what's been going on?
Let me touch one other sort of military aspect of this, and then we'll talk about the international thing. Hostages.
Yes.
So Hamas grabbed hostages out of Israel, some of whom were Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And they're holding those hostages. Well, the other hostages that Hamas has are the Palestinian people, because they're hiding, and they use ordinary Palestinian citizens,
Mm-hmm.
women, children, kids, all elderly, as human shields.
Right. They don't care about their own people.
Right. So they will hide one of their communication centers or military headquarters in a mosque or a hospital or a school. So they're down in the basement planning their next attack. Up above them is a school or a hospital. The Israelis know where it is. They've given warning to get out.
That's horrible.
They hit it, and then they say, oh, look, you're killing children. Well, they use their own population as a human shield. They keep the people they're supposedly representing, they're killing as hostages.
Right.
From the Israelis' point of view, they're conducting a ground campaign in urban combat, clearing an area to destroy a military foe, while they're simultaneously trying to conduct hostage rescue operations. So a grueling conventional ground combat in an urban environment,
Mm-hmm.
combined with highly specialized, fast special operations strikes to go in, grab hostages, and get them out. Doing these two things at the same time militarily is a nightmare.
It's very challenging.
It's extremely, extremely challenging. So that's one of the problems that they're also having to deal with. So now back to your
Well, and let me just interject there also. I have seen videos with Hamas and training camps training little bitty children to kill Jews.
They're propagandized from day one.
Yes. So these are not normal people. I'm bringing this up again because this was brought up in the conference. There were still some Israeli friends that were able to come and participate in the conference.
And some came in by Zoom or
some
Skype.
came in by Zoom. One who joined us was actually senior advisor to the Prime Minister, Netanyahu.
True.
And one of the things that was brought up on a regular basis is that Westerners do not understand or don't want to understand that this is a terrorist group. And my background, as you know, is in humanitarian development. So I have seen very poor Palestinians in the West Bank. It's not a good situation. There are things that we can do to make those things better. But Hamas is a terrorist organization, and the Palestinian Authority mainly back them up.
Of course,
they're involved.
Not a word from them. They're silent.
Not a word from them. And you know, Chris, at UNGA, at the UN General Assembly in September, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, made a comment that I wonder now was sort of a foreshadowing. He knew what was going on,
right? And
that was if people thought that there could be peace in the Middle East, and I think he was referring a lot to the Abraham Accords, if we thought there could be peace without Palestinians getting what they wanted and having rights, I don't know what he meant by that exactly, then we were sadly mistaken. So I don't know if maybe that was a foreshadowing of what was to come.
Yeah, it's very curious to figure out who knew what when. And I think that that's one of these things that over time, you know, more will be revealed, but it's not going to be anything that is instantly available to us. There's one other piece of this sort of psychological operation that I want to talk about, and that is there's a natural reaction or consequence politically in Israel where at some point, maybe not now, maybe not in the next few weeks, but at some point, there's going to be a reckoning. The Israeli people are going to say, hey, wait a minute. How could you have had that intelligence blind spot?
Mm-hmm.
How could you have been slow to respond? How could you have been, and there's going to be a lot of sort of second guessing and really, frankly, some honest like, hey, how did you not know that the Hamas was doing this? You know they hate our guts.
Right.
You know they're planning to destroy us. So the first thing is there's going to be some kind of a commission formed, guaranteed, where they're going to do like we had our own 9/11 commission, which was a joke, but grossly inadequate on several levels. But they're going to have their own commission for accountability on what happened.
Okay.
But the other thing that's going to happen with the increase in criticism from the UN, from the international community, whatever that means, is that pressure is going to be brought to bear that will separate or attempt to separate the Israeli people from their government. And that pressure is going to create internal domestic problems for Netanyahu.
Which will be exacerbated by the fact that the international community is supporting Hamas in different ways.
Right. And so Hamas and its allies, Iran, knows this, and they will look to exploit that separation or that tension between the general population and the Israeli government.
I hadn't thought about that.
Because they're going to say, hey, wait a minute. You said you were going to protect us. You said you were in charge. You said you had a plan. What about us? Our people were killed. What did you do? And that is, that's yet to be
And
resolved.
You can understand people being very upset about that as well. Let me talk a minute about the international community because we have severe problems at the root of the matter. The United Nations is supporting the Palestinian Authority. One of the ways is through this UN working agency. UN is UNRWA, UN Refugee Working Agency, I believe it is, that funds the Palestinian Authority. I think we give them a year, $6 billion.
And they're running the UN camps in Gaza as well, right?
Yes, and the Palestinian Authority is one of the groups that has this curriculum where they're teaching Palestinian children to hate Jews, to be anti-Semitic. So Trump defunded UNRWA, and guess what? Biden has funded it again.
Shocking.
I'm going to give you a few more examples here because we're hearing a lot of talk in the international community. Did so-and-so say a declaration in support of Israel? Did Biden, did our State Department, they actually issued something that was one of those wishy-washy, we condemn violence on both sides. And then they had to retract it because people were angry about it. The UN did that. But my point is, some people like Biden may be saying the right things right now, but let's see what happens, because we need action, not talk. He has funded UNRWA again. The EU gives money to the Palestinian Authority, which, like I said, does this curriculum stuff, anti-Semitism. They're hugely anti-Semitic. So we, as a Western civilization, are funding what eventually works its way to Hamas. So there's deep roots that I could see, the anger about that as well with our Israeli friends. It's righteous anger. I'm not talking about begrudging anger that rubs you the wrong way. You can see why they are angry.
These are not petty differences. Yeah,
they're not petty differences. And, Chris, people don't give Trump enough credit for what he did. And as you know, I had the privilege of working alongside the Trump White House. I was working for Concerned Women for America, VP of International Affairs at that time. And we saw him do a lot of things. CWA went over to Israel when he moved the embassy from, to Jerusalem.
right.
People have been talking about doing that in the United States, presidents for decades, and nobody did it.
Right.
He did that. The Abraham Accords are, like I said, I think they're genius, because they're mutually beneficial for Israel and the other countries. And I think that they can also be expanded, and that might be one way towards making the future a little bit better. But he did this Peace to Prosperity plan that I told you about. He did so many things to show that we were actually pro-Israel, not to just give talk about it like Biden has done. He even came out one time, I don't even know when it was, but Tlaib, he said he admired her. And who could admire someone who talks so evil?
So what you're going to see, and what our viewers and listeners need to key in on, is that there's also going to be a lot of manipulation and psychological operations, efforts to condition people through the news media.
Right.
So the language that's used, the BBC, for example, won't call Hamas terrorists.
Right.
Right. There's all these little word games that are played, and they're very deliberate. But I think the lesson, or the in the back of your mind while you're listening to all the rhetoric that's going to be flying around, particularly once Israel launches the ground operation into North Gaza, we need to be very insightful, careful, scrupulous about what is being said and how it's being said, so we get truthful reporting and accurate information about what's going on, and not fall for propagandized hysteria and a lot of loose, reckless talk that doesn't accurately reflect what's really going on.
Chris, can I just say this? And it is a sign of this moral relevancy that is just rampant through the world right now and in the United States. But the basis of it is evil. Because how can you stand up for people who are beheading people and kidnapping women and children? And how can you stand up for that? That's evil at its core. And this moral relevancy that we seem to have, we see it in our country with the lack of rule of law. We're not hard on criminals anymore. We have opened our borders. Those people are coming in, not many of them, but there are many terrorists coming in that we don't know.
Hundreds identified after the fact.
Yes, and you guys did a big report on that. This moral relevancy it is not just unwise, it's evil at its core, because there's a difference between truth and a lie, and right and wrong.
And to your point, in really sort of elaborating or taking that to the next level or step, as you're watching news reports, as you're listening to political dialogue and fights over this entire issue, whether it's domestically in the United States over support or spending, whether it's people engaging with Hamas supporters, and there's lots of them in the United States, particularly in academia. The moral relevancy issue, you've got to be sure to use sort of a intellectual or moral jujitsu, where they're trying to use jujitsu. They're going to say Israel's effort and action into Gaza is going to be turned back on them. And they're going to be calling Israelis war criminals, and they're going to be claiming that they killed indiscriminately, that they engaged in terror attacks. Well, what was the foundation? What was the predicate? What's the proximate cause of this entire thing. The Hamas attack.
Yes, exactly.
And so,
what about terrorists? Do you not understand?
So there's going to be an increasing effort to disconnect those things.
Yes.
And to isolate Israel.
That's right.
And put all the focus and blame on that.
And that's why I'm glad we're talking about this today, because I want people to be aware of that and say, no, this is a terrorist organization. And the deal with the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, is, my experience is, they don't want peace. They've had a long time where they could have had peace. It's been offered to them repeatedly. If you just look at this Trump Peace to Prosperity plan, and I'm a nerd, I'm a policy nerd, so I read it, and I was like, this is amazing, because Israel actually had to give up portions of their land, which Israel was interested in this plan. They were, I don't know if they used the word support it, but they were working their way towards that. They were speaking very favorably about it. They would have to give up portions of their land. It gave like $50 billion initially to the Palestinians in order for economic development.
To stand up the...
Yes, it was. And that is really what helps the people at the core to bring peace and security and stability to an area, especially in the Middle East, is if you build it up economically. So they even had ideas for roads and bridges and things from Israel to Palestine, or the Palestinians. But that was the point. They were also giving the Palestinians their own sovereign state.
Right. And that was the key.
But the thing is, Chris, is they didn't want it. They didn't even want that. I have just, this plan also was, it was called by, I can't remember his name, but somebody who had worked for National Security Council under Nixon and Ford. Right. He said, this is like the best plan we've had in decades. But the Palestinians would not even, they actually rejected it before it was even issued, before it was put out. So it's just my understanding that they don't really want peace. In their charter, going back to what we began with, is that they want to kill Israelis.
So a lot of pressure is going to be brought to bear. There's going to be huge developments in the next few days. The ground attack into northern Gaza, the Israelis will control the media environment around what's going on, unlike some other places. Mm-hmm. They will... But there's going to be reporting, and there's going to be images, and there's going to be, it's going to be hard. I mean, I think Netanyahu signaled his very clear intention early on. He's going to destroy them. He's going to destroy Hamas, and that is not going to look pretty. And so I think the population, American population, Israeli domestic population, needs to take that into account. Sometimes I think our world of information is wonderful, and sometimes I think it's tough.
It's hurtful sometimes,
if you had live coverage of the landing at Normandy, they may not have carried out the rest of the campaign.
Right, that's right.
Because it was that bad, right? So, and so bad things are going to happen, and it's going to be hell on earth. But the question is, what do you do to combat evil? What do you do? How does Israel stand up for itself? When you look at the images of what the Palestinian terrorists did when they came in on the ground and attacked those Israeli settlements and villages, how do you shrug and go, oh, well, too bad?
You don't.
You can't.
You get pushed to a point where you have to defend your country.
And there's nothing wrong with defending yourself.
That's right.
If you're punched and attacked, you're allowed to fight back and defend yourself.
Yes.
And for the moral equivocation and double talk wrapped around that now, this can be very misleading to people. And they need to not be confused or misled by it.
Yes.
So before we close out, I'm going to give you the last word, and I'm also going to ask that you tell our viewers and listeners how they can find out about your work and your organization, your social media, all those sorts of things.
Well, do I have a couple minutes to talk about beyond the invasion, the way forward?
Yeah, you get the last word.
Because I've really kind of been convicted that whenever we talk about how bad our government is, or the international community, or the situations are, we have to be thinking about a blueprint for the way out.
A solution.
Yeah. And, in the context of what has gone on, to talk about this solution, I talk about it humbly. It's just a small aspect of it, but I think that we should talk about it. One thing I just mentioned, we need a different administration. The difference between our administration and what the Trump administration did to support Israel is night and day. But I came here to talk about the Abraham Accords in Hungary. And, you know, the Hungarian foreign minister here, Peter Szijjártó, was the only, who I've interviewed, right, was the only head of state from another country that was over, from this area, that went over for the signing of the Abraham Accords. So Hungary has a real dedication and support of Israel. They are sometimes the only country that stands up in support of Israel in the EU. Sometimes they're alone on that, but they do that. And yeah, Minister Szijjártó, who I got to interview for my own Counterpoint Institute event in Washington, D.C. about the Ukraine war, he believes, and I agree with him, that we should focus our policy and strategy on expanding the Abraham Accords. There was actually a study done that said that if we could bring 11 more countries in to this, that over the next decade, it would provide like 400 million jobs in the Middle East, something like $1 trillion. And those jobs in the Middle East are very important because in certain places of the Middle East, and you know, I've traveled throughout the Middle East as well, there's high unemployment, and that's part of the instability and the unrest. So I think that, like I said, these are a genius way to normalize relations with Israel, provide security to the Middle East. And I do believe, now, like I said, the Palestinians don't want peace. They don't want the money that we would have given them through this Peace to Prosperity plan for in that situation. But I think that leaders of Arab states, their wisdom will prevail as we go forward in keeping their contract under the Abraham Accords, because it is so mutually beneficial for them.
It's in their own interest to do it.
It's in their own interest.
Providing money and jobs and trade and all the things that they can't do for themselves.
That's exactly right. And like I said, I have spent more time actually in Arab states, Arab nations, than I have in Israel. And I think that that's a smart way of approaching where some governments throughout the Middle East, they have no respect for democracy. So they're not going to sign them because they want to uphold Western idea of democracy, but they will sign it if it looks beneficial for their coffers. Yeah. So to answer your question, you said to tell people about Counterpoint. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I want to give you the last word, and that was an excellent last word because I think it highlighted the solution, the way forward. But also, as part of the last word you can have is to let people know about your organization, your work,
and my book,
and your book, and where to find you, and where to read more about your efforts.
Like you said, I'm the first international senior fellow for the Center for Fundamental Rights here in Hungary, and I'm very proud of that. In this context, like I said, Hungary has been a great friend to the Jews. This was the safest place for Jews to be during World War II.
Correct. And the safest place in Europe now. The Israeli ambassador himself said that.
That's right. That's right. He did at the conference. There were 1 million Jews here during 1940s era and 1930s, 1940s. But when Hitler came on the scene, 60 to 70,000 Jews from neighboring countries fled into Hungary because they knew that they would be protected here. Now, after the Germans invaded, and there was a puppet Hungarian government put up that was controlled by the Nazis and
right.
Nazi sympathizers,
right.
that they were no longer safe. They were deported by the same guy that deported Jews all over Europe. What was his name? Eichmann. Eichmann, the guy that actually came up with, he was part of the creation of the Jewish so-called solution.
Right.
So even during that time, though, Chris, what I found in my research was so interesting is that tens of thousands of Hungarians came out to protest and to actually try to shield the Jews who were being deported. Hundreds of them were put in jail. And this was from the American Jewish Yearbook from 1945, 1946 that talked about this. Christians wearing the yellow star.
Yeah.
To stand in solidarity with their friends, getting their belongings and hiding them in their own homes so that they wouldn't be taken by the Nazis.
The Hungarian people were remarkably courageous in that regard.
They were. Cardinal Mindszenty and other Catholic leaders. They hid Jews in different places in the religious buildings and institutions. He went to jail for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, they were great friends. So I'm very proud to be here. I wrote this book about Hungarian national sovereignty. What I just mentioned is a part of it because it shows the struggle of Hungarians for their sovereignty with other countries coming in and occupying them and trying to change the will to survive, the psychological will to survive that we just discussed. And Hungarians wouldn't have it. Then they were occupied by the Soviet Union for decades. And after they pushed them out, which Prime Minister Orban was a part of the Fidesz party that pushed them out, they have set about building a democratic society here. And it's a beautiful, prosperous society right here in the middle of Europe. Yet the EU and the Biden administration are really trying to malign them constantly. The EU has kept back their own money from them. They put sanctions on them because they stand up for family. They're not into the transgender stuff. They wouldn't allow that kind of curriculum in their schools. And so the EU is very angry about it. Our own ambassador to Hungary, David Pressman, is extremely angry about it and maligns them on his social media. He's not diplomatic in any way, shape, or form.
He's actually a disgrace.
He is a disgrace. He's an embarrassment. And anyway, so that's the Center for Fundamental Rights. And my book will be out in December in English, going to have a launch in New York City, and then in Hungarian in February. And then, of course, I am president of Counterpoint Institute, and I hope that your listeners will go to Counterpoint Institute, sign up for our newsletter, because I'm going to have a newsletter coming out soon about the Israeli situation, what we've been doing here in Hungary, the officials that were with us working on these issues. And I'd love to have some feedback from your listeners.
What's your website?
It is counterpointinstitute.org.
And how can people find you on social media?
I have my own social media, Dr. Shea DC, which is Instagram and Twitter. And also there's Counterpoint DC on Twitter, Counterpoint Institute on Instagram. And we'd love you to follow us. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you for all your insights on this important conference we both attended. I think folks got a much broader, much fuller idea, not just of the conference, but of what's going on in Israel with respect to Hamas and their brutal attack and the situation in Gaza. And also good promotion of our friends at the Center for Fundamental Rights
who deserve it.
Been so kind to host us
right.
For this conference and to be allowed to use their studio facilities. So our deep thanks to all of them. I'm very pleased today to be joined by my good friend and colleague, Zoltán Koskovics, who is the geopolitical analyst at the Center for Fundamental Rights here in beautiful Budapest, Hungary. And Zoltán was one of the key leaders and sort of facilitators, panel hosts on a conference that was just held here, an international pro-Israel summit. And it was hosted by the Center for Fundamental Rights. Zoltán, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be back here, Chris. It's always fantastic to talk to you.
You're a returning visitor to On Watch. We talked about some craziness in our American foreign policy before, but today I'd like to focus a little bit on this fabulous conference, the summit that you held, this pro-Israel summit. And the timing couldn't be more significant because of the attacks on Saturday. From your perspective, from the center, as you saw the attacks take place, knowing you had this conference planned months ago, what was the decision to go forward and to try to keep the focus on what was going on in Israel?
Yeah, those were a chaotic few hours. It was quite traumatic, not nearly as traumatic as to the people of Israel, to whom I would once again like to express my shock and my sympathies after this heinous attack on Saturday during the Sabbath. It was incredible. But yes, we were planning this summit for many, many weeks and months prior to this attack. The original idea was to celebrate the opportunities for peace and prosperity that the Abraham Accords opened up for the entire region there. I wrote 2 articles speaking about how the world seems to be descending into more and more conflict and chaos.
Right.
But almost paradoxically, the Middle East, until then, had a better chance and a shot at true security and growing wealth. Unfortunately, it wasn't just us who saw that opportunity, but it was also the terrorists. And I believe one of the chief reasons why they decided to launch this attack was indeed to torpedo the very good processes that were started by the Abraham Accords. And when we woke up to this catastrophe on Saturday, it happened early in the morning, Budapest time.
Right.
The first thought was obviously that of shock and pain, and we thought that we would have to cancel because a lot of high-profile guests were expected from Israel, and we knew that it would be either impossible or very difficult for them to make it on Monday. But that thought was there, but it went away very quickly as we realized that there is a historic obligation as a friend of Israel, as an ally of Israel for Hungary, and for the Hungarian conservatives to show support at this very dark moment.
So it's a very interesting thing. The Hungarian people, the Hungarian government, and in particular the center here, the Center for Fundamental Rights, has this strong bond and drive and affinity with Israel.
Yes.
Explain that. An American would say, well, why would Hungary care about Israel? What's the connection? Why does that happen?
Well, there's different angles from which this could be approached. Let me start from modern times. We in Hungary face a very difficult fight against the globalist left in the world. The reason for that, the basic fundamental reason for that, is that Hungary is displaying a successful conservative sovereignist position and policies. That is why they are attacking us. If we were not successful, they wouldn't be, because, let's face it, Hungary isn't a major country that can, on its own, without special achievements, influence global events.
Right.
But as a prospective model for conservative governments, we can sort of become a lighthouse.
Yeah, and that makes the left crazy. It drives them out of their minds that there's this successful conservative government and country. The people are successful in the heart of Europe. How can this be? Why aren't you jumping in with all the leftist social democrat, blah, 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 and the rest of the EU? Right.
Exactly. And what is the other small country that is almost like a lighthouse in this sense, defending its sovereignty despite hardship over many, many decades, that defends against the left's manipulations, that wishes to preserve its national identity, that is Israel.
Right.
And so there is a very strong political ideological alliance based on that fact. Yeah. That's one of the many reasons why the Hungarian right and the Israeli conservatives find themselves in a situation where we are natural friends and allies.
So your conference was enormously successful from my point of view. I got to participate, but I also got to sit and watch and listen to people. And then even when the conference wasn't on, when there was time to meet people, coffee breaks, lunch, mix and mingle, a huge success. And so what are your big, sort of takeaway conclusions or the key points that people should understand from this conference?
One thing that I'm only now recognizing is that Chris is extremely modest. He was one of the stars of the panel I was honored to moderate.
Or because you moderated it, that's why.
But jokes aside, I think the message that we wanted to get across was that at this dark moment in history, it is the duty of every human being with decency and every European country to stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel. Because I think we knew, even as we had this summit, that hard times are coming, and not everybody who at the moment on Monday were still preaching about their support to Israel would stay the course.
Right.
And I think since then we have found that unfortunately many in the globalist liberal left have decided to abandon Israel. And that is one of the saddest things I've seen, especially here in Europe. This continent has a special responsibility given the dark century, the one before this one, the 20th century, to not tolerate anti-Semitism. And what we saw in Israel on Saturday was the largest, most violent pogrom of Jewish people since the Second World War. And how did Europe react to this? Well, unfortunately, we saw a string of pro-Hamas demonstrations in large Western European cities, if you can believe this.
Yeah.
This is astonishing. And I think one of the messages that we should get across as clearly as possible that is intolerable, that is unpardonable, especially here in Europe.
Yeah. And the contrary is true here in Budapest, where night before last, there was a very large pro-Israel rally down by the river across from Parliament, where many people gathered to support Israel and make a very loud, proud statement in support of them.
It was a solemn occasion, maybe not loud, but it resonated greatly. I think it created a very clear indication that Hungarians would never stand with terror. I'm glad it happened. I'm also glad that there have not been any pro-Hamas demonstrations here in Hungary. And the Prime Minister just today, in an interview to the Hungarian Public Radio, announced that there would not be, so they would not tolerate any pro-terror demonstrations. Because let's face it, the murders, the rapes that happened on that Black Day in Israel, they are not something to be celebrated. And those who do, they do not belong here on this continent.
As we close out, I want to give you the opportunity to let our viewers and our listeners learn more about your work, your publications you're writing, but also the center, and where can they find out more about what you're up to and what the Center for Fundamental Rights is doing?
Well, the most important thing that we are doing is to build an international network of conservative forces to fight for the true values of the West. It may seem a little bit strange that conservatives would organize international networks, but strange events have led to this. Our opponents, political opponents, and increasingly our political enemies on the left, they have been exercising this tool of politics, creating international networks for many decades now, and they have a huge advantage there. Unfortunately, it has become clear over the last 15 years, could have become clear earlier, that this tool, this political weapon, that of creating networks, is an effective one.
Yeah.
And as a result, like in any conflict, if the enemy has something that works, we need to adapt, change our tactics, and to actually use the enemy's weapons against them. As for myself, I'm most active on Twitter. You can find me under my own name. I've written essays to many Hungarian publications, and you can find me in the Newsweek archives as well. And we all, I think, I'm driven by a responsibility to my children. And I think that is true for most of my colleagues here in the center. We understand that Hungary just regained our sovereignty not very long ago. And that means that we value it more. And we understand that there are dark clouds gathering. And we want to provide a place in Hungary where our kids can grow up to be successful, happy, free adults.
Well, you're having great success here. You're a wonderful example and model, not just for Europe, but frankly, America could learn a hell of a lot from what you're doing. which is the subject of Dr. Shea's book forthcoming. But we really appreciate your time. We appreciate the Center for allowing us to use your studio, and for the tremendous conference that you folks put on. This is Pro-Israel Summit this week. So my thanks to the center and to you and to
Thank you for coming.
your Director General, Miklos Zanto, for hosting us.
Thank you for coming, and we're going to keep having these events where conservatives can think together and act together for the common good.
That's terrific. I'm Chris Farrell, on watch.